Officially, for those of you I don't know, my name is Anna Wyeth, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at Sidwell Friends. Thanks for joining us tonight for this Conversation with Friends, our second this year. Before we get started, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items. I do want to encourage everyone, if you feel comfortable, to keep your video on. It certainly helps us feel the full participation of the room and of everyone who's joined tonight. I would also encourage you to change your Zoom name if it doesn't already include your full name, and add your connection to Sidwell Friends, whether that means your class year as an alum, your constituency, like being a former parent or a faculty member. You can think of it like your virtual name tag. It just lets everyone in attendance know who you are and who they are. I will also ask you guys to keep yourselves on mute just to minimize disruptions. We're going to save asking questions until the dedicated Q&A toward the end of the event. If you have questions that come up as our speakers are talking, please message them to me, Anna Wyeth, in the chat, and we will keep track of those questions and get to them during the Q&A. So now, finally, obviously, the real reason that you all are here. I'm going to introduce our speakers. Bo Kemp is our featured speaker tonight, class of 1987. Bo partners with a national network of advisors, advocates, government and business leaders to help drive growth, tackle major initiatives, and boost efficiency in municipalities. Highly experienced in structuring and execution of public-private partnerships, Bo has a reputation for driving innovation in municipal utilities, public infrastructure, and economic development for legacy cities. He spent the first decade of his professional career in finance with Morgan Stanley and TSG Capital Group, a private equity group. Then, after leading Cory Booker's successful transition to the office of the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, Bo became the city's business administrator. And for the last 15 years, he has worked with municipal executives around the country to address some of the hardest to solve problems, and has now turned his attention to opportunity zones. He's a graduate of Yale and Harvard Business School. Leading the conversation tonight with Bo are two very special alumni. As you all know, tonight's event is in collaboration with our Black Alumni Alliance, and the BAA at Sidwell Friends was founded in 2018 as the first formalized affinity group among our alumni community. The mission of the BAA is to unite Sidwell Friends alumni from around the world who identify and are allied with Black and African heritage diaspora communities. The BAA fosters intergenerational relationships between Black alumni, highlights and celebrates alumni contributions, and creates meaningful social and professional engagement opportunities between alumni. They also build purposeful connections to faculty, students, and the life of the school, enhancing Black alumni pride, participation, and philanthropic commitment to Sidwell Friends. The BAA has an advisory council of volunteers who provide guidance on programming, communications, and engagement opportunities, and it is our two co-clerks of the BAA Advisory Council who will be leading this conversation tonight. Akinyi Sagoe-Moses, class of 2011, is a senior associate director at APCO Worldwide based in New York. She advises nonprofits, foundations, corporations, and governments in designing and implementing programs and partnerships to improve economic and social outcomes for vulnerable communities. Her practice focuses on strategic philanthropy and social impact with an emphasis on economic mobility, gender equity, and racial justice in North America, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. In 2019, she was named one of the 100 most influential people of African descent in media under 40, big accomplishment. Akinyi writes on business, culture, and politics, and has been featured in leading publications and platforms including NPR, CNBC, Fast Company, Forbes, Slate, and the World Economic Forum. She holds a master's degree in global politics from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's degree in political science and African studies from Yale University. And finally, our second host tonight is Neville Waters, class of 1975. Neville has an extensive experience in marketing and communications and is currently working for the district government processing freedom of information requests. His background includes artist management, professional sports, and content development, including producing programming for radio and television. He has been a professional announcer and enjoys performing storytelling. A sixth-generation Washingtonian, Neville graduated magna cum laude from Springfield College in Massachusetts and earned his master's degree from Springfield as well, and later an MBA from Georgetown. He has served on the Sidwell Friends Alumni Network Advisory Board, formerly the Alumni Association Executive Board, and is currently also on the board of Center City Public Charter Schools and leads the Mount Zion Female Union Band Foundation that is working to preserve the oldest African-American cemetery in Washington, D.C. Other achievements include an NBC Fellowship Award, the National Black MBA Scholarship, and the Walter Cates Foundation Award. Please welcome all three of our speakers. I'm going to turn it over to them, and we're going to get started with tonight's conversation.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was a tremendous introduction. Hopefully we can live up to the hype, you know. I am really excited about having the chance to have this conversation, and I would like to try to jump in because I know our time is limited, and I think we're going to have some interesting questions also. So, um, Bo and I had a chance to chat a little bit, and I also know some other things about him. But the first thing I got to ask you, you just came back from Antarctica. I mean, what did you learn there? What did you love? I was gonna say, I know what you hated because it was cold, but
It was
tell
cold.
me about that experience.
Yeah, thank you. I just got back from Antarctica yesterday.
Wow.
It took 2 boats and 4 flights to get back home. It's always been a life dream to travel. A lot of that was inspired by my time at Sidwell Friends. Sidwell was actually one of the first places where I had met other people my age who had traveled outside of the country. Previous to that, I didn't, other than going to Canada. I'm originally from Detroit, so you can go to Canada in 15 minutes. But other than that, I didn't know people that had traveled outside of the United States. And so I've had a chance to go to all 7 continents now. Um, you know, I went to Antarctica partly because it was a dream, but partly because I was and am in search of a bunch of different experiences. And one of the things that I particularly wanted to experience was kind of a spiritual kind of journey. Um, in Antarctica, one of the things that's really clear is that although you may play an important role in a variety of people's lives, and possibly in a broader context, you're really small relative to nature. And one of the things that's very difficult to reflect is scale. So when you're there, you're surrounded by thousands of years of ice, thousands of years of air that's been trapped inside of ice. There are basically 4 classes of major animals, birds, sea lions, whales, and penguins. There are fish, but you don't really see much in the way of the fish. And there's just something about the enormity of the space that really puts you in kind of context. And I think perspective is one of the things that's very difficult for a lot of people to maintain. There are some people that don't have any perspective at all. And I found Antarctica really reframed perspective of me in relationship to the rest of the world in a way that I was hoping it would, but I was happily surprised that it did.
Gotcha. How long were you there?
2 weeks. So I traveled for 3. It takes several days to get there. You have to fly down to Ushuaia, which is, I'm mispronouncing the name, but it's at the very tip of Tierra del Fuego, which is basically the last location that you can board a ship. And then you cross the Drake Passage, which is the most dangerous waters in the entire world. They have, when I crossed, there were about 15 to 17 foot swells, which is actually very calm. They can get up to be 95 feet tall. And that's where most of the boats die that in the past. Once you get into the continental convergence area, which is where the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean actually meet the Southern Ocean, the Antarctic Ocean, the waves start to die down. And that's when you get to the beginning of the Antarctica Peninsula. And I was able to do 10 excursions. So most of the people that go to Antarctica, they go on a ship, they stay on the ship, and they look at Antarctica from far. I was able to get in a small dinghy. We went out to the islands. We did 10 excursions where you go out in the water. And then I did 2 continental landings where you land and you climb and you hike on the glaciers and the like and rocks. It is not hospitable to humans. It's less than 5,000 people are there in the summer, which is summer is right now. It snowed every single day. It's cold in the summer, and in the winter, the space doubles in size because of sea ice. But it's just an unbelievable place, fascinating, beautiful in nature and surroundings. And I was really very happy with the trip.
Well, no, that sounds awesome. That sounds
I have to
awesome.
ask you, Neville, before you continue, though, what felt colder, Chicago in winter or Antarctica in the summer?
You know what's so funny about that? Chicago in the winter is actually colder than Antarctica in the summer by a lot, not even close. But you do have to wear special gear when you're out there to make sure you don't freeze. There's a lot of stuff out there that can kill you.
I think my friends in Chicago will actually be proud of that.
They might be.
So look, let's go ahead and take this sharp turn to the professional, because Antarctica, that's not what you do. I mean, you're in economic development. So how did you get into that space?
Yeah, and what I currently am doing right now is I'm the CEO of something called the Southland Development Authority, which is a not-for-profit that oversees economic development for about 750,000 people in the south suburbs of Chicago. And I have a couple of investment funds that is from my previous life, all of which is not fully added in some of the my bio, just because I was traveling when a lot of the bio was put together. But it's a line related to it. And the short answer is I've kind of had 3 careers. I started as a private equity investment banker, kind of traditional, trying to be a capitalist career on Wall Street. Quickly kind of pivoted to what had always been my life's interest, is being an entrepreneur itself. So I've raised $100 million for different businesses that I've run, from media to biodiesel and the like. And by happenstance, one of my businesses got washed away with Katrina in 2005. And that's what connected me to Cory Booker when at the time he was running for mayor. And I started focusing on how do you turn around municipalities. And when he won the election, he asked me to run his transition. I had no experience doing anything related to government at all. But the opportunity felt interesting. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. And I find a kinship to places that have had large industrial bases that have been decimated and are now dealing with all of the issues that come from the depletion of that population and all the issues that come. And places like Newark are very similar to Detroit or Baltimore or Buffalo, New York, or Oakland, California. There's a number of places. And so the opportunity presented itself to actually engage in government. I think I told this story to you, Kiki, when we talked earlier, but one of the things, having had kind of a traditional private equity investment banking background, that I didn't fully appreciate about the role that government plays, is that when someone like us, most on this call, have a tree that falls on our house, the first thing you do is you pick up the phone and you call someone to cut the tree down, and you call your insurance company to get a claim. But when someone who's working class or lower socioeconomic status has a tree fall, they call their council person, they call their mayor. And because they don't have the same lifelines and the capacity to find someone who can cut that tree down or call their insurance company. And I didn't fully appreciate that until I started working in government. And one of the things that really struck me was that the folks who are working class deserve a functioning government to solve the issue of that tree as much as I deserve a functioning insurance company that provides me my insurance claim. But without investing in government, they will not get their issues resolved. And I can find other ways to get my issue resolved. And so I was struck by the need to support the functions of government, because those are the functions that support the broadest set of people in the country with the broadest sets of needs. And a lot of the conversation that I found people having about the fact that we didn't need government came from a place of privilege. And by that, I mean, people who had enough money to find other ways to resolve their problems didn't have to rely on government. Now, what I'll just say in the opposite of that is, I lived in Westchester County, New York during Superstorm Sandy, which is, one of the wealthier counties in the United States. Every house is, $1 million type house. When Superstorm Sandy came, all those people with $1 million houses stood outside of Iona College at a cardboard table when FEMA came and set up and gave out $5,000 checks to support people in need, right? So when disasters happen at a certain magnitude, regardless of your wealth status, you will rely on government. But it's only when it happens at really substantial magnitudes of crisis. Whereas a simple tree falling for someone who's working class is the equivalent of Katrina or Superstorm Sandy. It is for someone who's wealthy. And, but for the investment that we make in making government work, those people in some cases literally die. I'm in the city, so you hear some background noise. But that was really a turning point for me, and an appreciation for the role that's possible to play in focusing on government. My initial focus was on finance, because I'd come from a finance background. It was, how do we kind of deal with the fact that most of the cities are bankrupt? But it became very quickly obvious that you can't cut your way to profitability. You have to grow. And so I really turned a lot of my attention to economic development over the years, because that's really the driver to generate the revenue that's necessary to make investments in all of the functioning apparatus that's required to support everybody, whether you are, regardless of class or status.
I mean, Bo, your career has been so incredible, but the story that you just told about, about the realities that when a tree falls down, who do you call? I think it underscores this idea that, or rather, I think we talk a lot about the fact that we talk a lot in popular culture about government being broken. And I'm curious, because the example you shared in the case of FEMA especially shows that government does work. And so in what instances do you see real government really working well? And how can we kind of catalyze more of those moments?
I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to tell another story first, only because it's another thing that I've learned that was not my initial impression. I came from kind of a finance background, business school background that really focused on productivity and efficiency as the measure of whether or not a government was doing well or not doing well. And in that guise, it's very profit oriented. And one of the people that I had a chance to speak with really changed my opinion was Drew Dixon's mom, former mayor of DC. One of the things that she said to me was that government is really about effectiveness, not about efficiency. And I really took that to heart, and I think there's a lot of value there. And because we get used to comparing government to businesses, we're using the wrong metrics to evaluate performance. One of the things I've also learned is I've had a chance to work with a lot of really large, CEOs of companies because of the cities that I've worked in. The level of complexity that it takes to manage a city of 75,000 people, let alone a city of 1 million people, far, far, far outstrips what it takes to manage Google, what it takes to manage News Corp, what it takes to manage any of these major businesses. And I'll give you a simple example. If you were to audit the amount of money that Microsoft spent on caviar for any special events that they took, and you were to report that in the New York Times or the Washington Post, the level of scrutiny that would come to them is something that they don't see. But that's what happens to every single government entity all the time. So if you were to take that same CEO that we think is fantastic, and you were to audit how much money they spend on toilet paper, how much money they spend on caviar, for what event did they spend that money on? Was that the appropriate way to invest the dollars for shareholders? And you were to evaluate each and every single one of those decisions, that's what it takes to run a city. And only if that's your personal experience do you actually bring to the table the capacity to actually say, I can do better than what the people who are running cities do right now. And the only people who have an experience that really falls into that category that don't run cities are people who run very large organizations like the military. Everybody else who runs corporations, regardless of size, their experience set actually does not make them a good fit necessarily to be able to manage a city. So I didn't think I really answered your question, Kiki.
But you did it. You did in many ways, and it
Okay.
actually leads me to another one, which is, having started your career in the private sector, what led you to have this appreciation for the role of government, and kind of what keeps you engaged in kind of the trickiness of municipal development?
I do think that there's a lot to be said about the experience I've had at a place like Sidwell Friends. And at the time when I was at Sidwell, I found it to be a place that was, like you said, DEI before DEI was in, but genuine, and a place that I felt very accepted. I didn't know who the parents were of the kids that I was there, and I felt that everybody really made an attempt to try to be open and was caring. And I think part of the driver for me and for a lot of people is just the understanding of the magnitude of the need, right? And once you see the kind of need that is there, it's kind of hard to look away and just throw your hands up and say that I won't play any role at all. But I think for a lot of people, it's easy to ignore the need. But a place like Sidwell makes it, I think most of us are graduating. There's some people here that I went to school with. I see Tip and Catherine and Laura, and there are probably others that I can't see. It's very difficult, given the kind of experience that we had at Sidwell, to see that and just ignore it. And so I would attribute Sidwell to a lot of that. And then my personal upbringing, I moved around a lot as a kid before I went to Sidwell, and being from Detroit, having lived in Inglewood, California, and Long Beach before I moved to the Washington, D.C. area, I'd lived in a lot of neighborhoods that were similar to places like Newark. And so I was familiar with what that was and the kind of experiences that people had, and just always harbored a real interest in contributing.
So you've talked about a lot of cities that have, struggled admittedly in terms of development. But there's some cities like DC where you have like this, I guess what some people would call a renaissance, but admittedly also comes with a lot of displacement. And I know that's a subject that's on a lot of our minds. So for many of us who went to Sidwell and grew up in DC, we've seen this city shift so dramatically and many residents pushed out. And so I'm curious to get your perspective on how do you catalyze development while bringing people along with you? Does it always have to come with displacement?
So I give people a lot of disappointing answers in this question. And I have had the chance to work with a number of different municipal executives, mayors and county execs and the like around this. Change is always going to come. That's a guarantee. And it's impossible for you to promise people that change is going to come without displacement. And so I don't think that's what you should promise. But the question is, can displacement be done in a way that feels more equitable? Can displacement be, or can the development happen in a way where displacement feels equitable as opposed to inequitable? Can you leverage the change in a way that gives people some agency in their decision? Because what people really are upset about is the fact that they've been legacy residents in a place that has struggled for 20 years, and that finally, when people have decided to make an investment in their neighborhood, they immediately are the ones who don't get the benefit from that growth, right? And you can't make it perfect, but you can do a lot better. And a lot of it starts at a level of education. One of the most difficult things that's happened right now in our country that is obvious when I say it, but isn't obvious to see, is that there is no civic infrastructure. And by civic infrastructure, what I mean is there used to be block clubs or church groups or, bake groups and things of that nature that may be small, 20, 30 people, but those 20 and 30 people met on a regular basis, bridge clubs and things of that nature. And so when you needed to communicate an idea or you needed to gather information, there was probably 100 people in any given neighborhood that if you brought them together could reach another 1,000 to 2,000 people, where the level of trust in that connection was strong enough that you could be confident that the bottom-up feedback you were getting or the information that you wanted to kind of distribute to people would actually happen. The advent of the changes of the internet have broken that civic infrastructure apart. And without the civic infrastructure, the dialogue that needs to happen with the community is really difficult. It's super expensive, and it's difficult to maintain. And if you don't maintain it, what you lose is trust. And trust is that's the measure to really evaluate the performance and the relationship between a community and its elected officials, or for that matter, police and everybody else. But it only comes from frequency of communication. And the civic infrastructure that's gone inhibits that level of trust and communication. So it's really, really difficult right now. The people who've had some success have had to invest a lot of time and money in order to make important but often small gains. And it's difficult to do that at a regular and sustainable pace because of the effort that it takes to recreate that civic infrastructure that used to kind of naturally exist. We need to kind of create a naturally existing civic infrastructure again in order to facilitate the kind of feedback from the community directly to elected officials and vice versa that's really required.
That I think that was certainly not the easiest answer to give, but an honest one, and I very much appreciate that.
I want to ask something that I am personally interested in, and I think you have some insight. I know you're in Chicago, as you mentioned before, and I know there's some discussion about the Bears relocating their stadium or developing their stadium, but bringing it even closer to home, that we have a situation where the football team may be coming back to RFK Stadium while the basketball and hockey team may be leaving to go to develop a sports entertainment zone. Um, the municipal, I guess, investment or public investment in these sports facilities is generally characterized as economic development. Um, do you see the benefit in this? Is this, for a city like Washington, is it worth them, spending public money to lure one, to retain one? And in the grander scheme of things, is the owner right that, hey, look, I'm going to go out here and just make a bunch of money because I can develop this commercial area?
So this is a very difficult question. And I'll say a couple of things. First, I've been involved in the development of multiple arenas and stadiums around the country, as well as airports and casinos. So large scale that required public financing to get them done. Having said that, I personally believe that using public finance dollars to support economic development projects like stadiums is basically a tax on poor people, right? You're basically taking money from poor people and giving it to large corporate entities in the hopes that the return on your investment of that development project will make it worthwhile. Most cases, that is not the case. In most cases, that money could be spent in other ways that would have a bigger and broader impact on the society. Having said that, there are notable exceptions, one of which I was involved in. I've been involved in some that I don't think were positive net investments. I've been involved in one that was. The Prudential Arena in Newark, I helped to build. In fact, it was my job when Cory Booker was originally elected. He ran on a platform to kill that project. My job was to kill it. And so I was assigned to kill it. And, because I came from a finance background, I was not subtle. I would call the owner of the New Jersey Devils and I would tell him every day that the cost of steel in Chile was going up. And if I cut the steel down that he'd already put in the ground, I could sell it for enough money to get our money back. I was vicious. And I would threaten him and all the owners every day to destroy the project. But it became clear in the analysis that the cost of killing it and not building it was going to be greater than the cost of finishing the project. And so my job then became to finish the project and try to renegotiate all the elements of this to have it have a better community return on its investment. And for the first 6 years, first of all, I will humble brag, right? We built that arena on time and on budget in New Jersey. That is not a typical thing that anybody gets to say. So I'm very proud of that and the role that I played in making that happen. We opened with John Bon Jovi on time. And it was painful. The first 6 years where that arena was open, every article about the arena was negative. It didn't bring in the money. It didn't bring in the jobs. The development didn't come, all of these things. But if you were to look from year 7 today, billions of dollars have now been invested in and around that area as a result, almost exclusively, of having opened that arena. And that was one instance where the investment of $250 million of public funds at a time when we had a $250 million structural deficit that I was responsible for was actually the right decision. I didn't think it was at the time. Cory Booker didn't think it was. We ran against it. We tried to kill it. We only built it because we had no option, and it ended up being the right decision to do. An example where I think is also going to turn out to be right is Los Angeles. The football stadium that was built in Los Angeles is going to be a boon to LA and downtown LA, and will outstrip all of the incentives that they were provided for it. But generally speaking, that is not true. And most of the other places that are looking to attract and build a franchise to come, it doesn't make sense, particularly because of the economics of it. It takes 217 nights of operations to actually break even for a large-scale entity like that. And the most profitable thing you can do is Disney on Ice in an arena, and that's literal. I'm not making that up. Having a basketball game or having a hockey game is it's a loss leader. It's not a profitable thing to do. So you have to rely on the development around it. Coming back to RFK is an interesting proposition, and this is where it gets a little tricky, because the area around RFK has partially developed around some of the housing, but RFK has just been this albatross, right, that hasn't been developed. And when you have something that big, the cost of demolition of RFK is so large that if you don't invest at the kind of scale that you would need for a new stadium, you'll never redevelop that area. Just the economics of demolition is so costly that stands as a testament forever. So in Chicago, if the Bears leave Soldier Field will stand empty for decades, almost a guarantee. Just the millions of dollars that it costs to actually knock it down. And the cost isn't in the knocking it down. The cost is in the disposal. 60% of all the cost of demolition is the disposal of the product itself. There's no place to put it. It's very expensive. You have to truck it far away. So I say that to say that when you really start doing the cost benefit analysis, it's not always clear cut. As philosophically as I believe that using public funds to support those franchises is not the optimal way to do it, there are many reasons why it's a better alternative than what you have in front of you. And there are instances, one of which I was involved with, one of which I had nothing to do with, where the investment, I think, actually warrants actually spending that money.
Bo, I want to pivot to some of the questions that people raised in the lead up to today's conversation. And I think you've done a wonderful job, I think, of connecting your experiences to in the past to some of the most pertinent topics of today when it comes to urban planning. But I want to, one of the questions I want to raise to you really, I think, speaks to your work now at Southland Development Authority. And this comes from Chandra Christmas Rouse, who's the class of 12. How can we shift from solely focusing on connecting suburban cities to a large city like Chicago as an economic development strategy and start thinking about how we can better connect suburban cities to other suburban cities as an economic development strategy, particularly in the Southland area?
That's an interesting question. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. In fact, in order to make the connections valuable, they really can't be mutually exclusive. You know, the United States is the only place, well, it used to be the only place where the value locations to live were principally outside of the downtown. And that was driven largely by race, right? You know, everywhere else around the world, the center of France, the center of Paris is where the richest people live. And as you move outside of Paris, you get to poorer and poorer neighborhoods. The United States was the only place that was inverse, and our policies for decades were to try to push that you know, the development of the suburbs. The problem is density is the only sustainable economic development policy that really matters. Like if you're not building in density, what you're doing is you're actually creating a tax burden for people. And for a long period of time, that tax burden was being hidden because the suburbs had been built between the 50s and the 90s. And so they didn't need to redo their infrastructure until now. Right? Whereas the cities were built in the early 1900s and they started in the 60s and 70s having to rebuild their infrastructure. So it was obvious what the pain point of the rebuild of infrastructure was in cities. It's only now becoming obvious of that pain point in the suburbs. It's a long-winded way to answer the question. I don't think that the goal is to simply connect suburban cities to suburban cities, but it's to create the net where suburban city connection and major city connections are tied together so that you can create enough density in nodes, right? That the marginal investment in either maintenance or development becomes lower and lower and lower. And that's really the driver. You know, there are 31,000 people per square mile in Manhattan. And because of that, you know, one cop can service within a mile 31,000 people. But if you extrapolate the same concept for linear sewer, linear water, any of the other services, it means that for every dollar New York spends for a linear mile, they are actually getting a bigger efficiency and bang for their buck. But when you get out to the suburbs, you're talking about, you know, a city like Baltimore, which is a major city, is like 11,000 people per square mile, right? Boston is like 15,000 people per square mile. You start to drop really, really quickly in all of the efficiency indices. And that means that the marginal cost of either building or maintaining services or, you know, whether they be water, sewer, or police, skyrocket. And so creating population density in nodes that's connected by public transportation is really the key, whether it's between suburbs or between suburbs and major cities.
Bo, I have a great question that was also submitted, and I hopefully this person's here on the call. Faith Wheeler. The question is, how do you factor in reducing greenhouse gases and fossil fuel energy consumption during planning and implementation? And also, as a follow-up, what is Chicago's greatest source of greenhouse gases? And do you anticipate there being a time when Chicago will achieve carbon neutrality?
You may have to remind me again the first one, but the second
Sure.
question is buildings are obviously the biggest source of carbon gases everywhere. Buildings and asphalt. And so no city can completely be carbon neutral without a major investment in greening. Chicago actually has a lot of leads on a lot of other places just because we're a fairly green city. We're not as park rich as the Washington, D.C. area, but because of the Great Lakes and a lot of the wetlands that we have, We have a better balance than most major cities in America do. And so that's a major plus for the city of Chicago. It's actually one of the assets that I think will lead Chicago to be one of the better cities to live in the course of the next 20 or 30 years. In terms of policies, ask the first part of the question again.
That you factor in reducing greenhouse gases and fossil fuel energy consumption during, planning and implementation of projects.
Yeah, not to be redundant, but repetition is the essence of pedagogy. Someone told me once. Density, right? Density. So the issue that I was describing about linear mileage and the marginal cost is really driven to that point, which is that you want to build more vertically as opposed to horizontally because of all the issues that we're talking about in terms of sustainability. You want to cluster as much as you can so that you actually leave more space for green space. And all of those things have a major role in greenhouse gases and all of the issues related to sustainability. The biggest issue that everyone has to deal with is water. We are blessed in Chicago to have the largest pot of fresh water anywhere, basically in the world. But managing water flow is a major component to addressing these issues of not just greenhouse gases, but sustainability largely. And what you'll find is there is a substantial inequity in the investment of the infrastructure necessary to manage water in particular across communities. And so if you're trying to be smart and advanced, in addition to the density that you need, in addition to mass transit is a major issue that addresses a lot of the greenhouse gases. You've got to be thinking about water and water flow. And then all the other issues that everybody is dealing with, whether it's, how do I use more solar and wind and other things? How do I use, thermal, geothermal kind of, ways of heating and cooling homes, all those sorts of issues you can deal with. And that you can deal with that in the context of zoning, but the other issues have to be dealt with at a infrastructure level because they require so much money. And this is one of the problems that we've had, that most major cities in America, no matter how much investment LA makes in public transportation, they're just never going to be at the same level of DC. They're never going to be at the same level of Philly or Boston and Newark. Newark is in that category too, but New York. And that's going to be difficult. And it makes those places unsustainable in the long run.
Now, if I just want to follow up, you said that you don't really expect or anticipate that any major city could achieve carbon neutrality.
So that is a rare moment of non-optimism from me. But maybe I should rephrase that and say, in my lifetime. I just think that the number of changes that have to be made in the day-to-day activity of us as humans is so great that it's the transition that's required is too great in the next 50 years. Knock on wood, I live 50. To actually see that actually come to fruition. And without the investments already having been made, it's very difficult to get there. There are a few cities that are exceptions to that. DC is a really interesting model because relative to other major cities, it built its major public transportation at a much later date, right? So they are an example of, as you build transportation out, and they built the orange and blue lines and the red line. Well, when I started at Sidwell, the orange line stopped at Silver Spring, right? Didn't go to Tinleytown. You couldn't get to Dulles by train, all that kind of stuff. And they've actually done, DC, a very good job of leveraging that built infrastructure to have a lot of positive change with regards to sustainability, but also in terms of quality of life, in terms of density and development and all the other things. And frankly, that's why the DC area is the only area in the United States that didn't suffer a recession in 2008 and 2021.
Bo, I'd love to, just in the interest of time, make sure we get to some of the other questions in the chat, which I find really interesting. So one of them, actually, well, two of them come from Martin, but I'm going to ask one of them to start. So thanks, Martin, for the thoughtful questions. The first is, how have the residents of Southland's area responded to the Development Corporation's efforts? Was there skepticism at first? And in Martin's words, I'll paraphrase, as an urban planner, I often see a lot of hesitance from residents when they hear major development is coming. It's not that they don't want economic opportunities or more amenities, but they worry about being displaced. So have municipalities in your footprint found ways to mitigate displacement while fostering growth?
So, you know, our communities, particularly those communities who've suffered for a long period of time, have good reason to be skeptical, right? So when, in every community that I've basically worked in, with only a couple of exceptions, have been places where they've been legacy residents who've had decades and decades and decades of disappointment. So it's, to use a bad analogy, but maybe one that, it's like being named the coach of the Detroit Lions before this year, right? You've been losing for so long, right? You can't come in and say, we're going to win a Super Bowl this year. It's like, well, buddy, you went 0 and 18 last year. So a lot of the work that we do starts with helping people suspend their disbelief, right? Not telling people to believe in you, not telling people to trust you, just asking them to suspend their disbelief about what is possible, because you have to start with small baby steps of building that trust that we were describing in the civic infrastructure. And that's a large part of what I start with having to do. And I've got to do it both at the legislative level with individual mayors and city council members and elected officials in the state, and you have to do it at the ground level with all the community. And so it's a tremendous level of work, right? And you start with asking people to suspend their disbelief, and then you actually have to start doing small things that give them a reason to continue to extend that suspension, right? And it takes a while before you turn the tide for them to be believers in what you're doing. Many people think you can just ask for them to believe in you right away, and you cannot, right? Because they've got decades of experience and history to show why they believe that you will disappoint them, because other people have. And so it's really, there's a lot of pressure to demonstrate in both big and small ways that you will do what you say you will do. And lots of times it's also not even about accomplishing everything. It's about demonstrating the level of effort and interaction. And so again, I come back to this idea of the civic infrastructure, because you need a two-way dialogue. But to get that dialogue, you actually have to invest in building the system in many cases, which has been decimated, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, and just by technology. So there's a real effort there. And the threat and the concern of displacement is very, very real. And as I answered honestly before, you cannot promise people that displacement won't happen. But there are a lot more aggressive things that we can do to support people actually not being taken advantage of in displacement, right? And so that people have a chance to, like I said, have agency to decide when they're going to sell their house, as opposed to be forced to sell their house. But there's a lot of tension in that, right? Because I built a $45 million, well, I helped to build a $45 million art center. And in that space, there was two women who were 80 years old, whose families had moved up from the South in 1940, that owned homes, that refused to sell their homes. They were both single. They had moved up from the South and had bought those homes in 1940. It paid off those homes in the 80s. And that home was a representation of their entire life for them. And despite the fact that they were going to be paid handily, get a new house for free, in one case, the person who was working on the project, his mother was one of the owners of that house. She refused, despite all of that, to sell the house. So they built this $45 million structure around the two houses, literally. So if you look in the back of the structure, there's little slots where the houses sit, and they built the whole building around them because there was no other choice. Now, that's a non-optimal outcome to the process, but what it speaks to is how personal this issue is for a lot of people, right? She had kind of migrated And actually, in one case, the woman was white, the other one was black. So it wasn't just black migration. It happened to be in Gary, which is a predominantly black city. But these people had migrated here and had lived here all their life. And that house, she intended to die in that house. That simple, period. And if it meant that the development of a project that was going to support 45,000 students and 80,000 people couldn't happen, so be it for her. And that's the tension that you deal with every single day in the role that you play around economic development. And so these issues often get kind of watered down into things that are easy. But it's not an easy call of whether or not, that woman should be willing to sell. I mean, you can't make her do anything, but should she be willing to sell her house? Her son, who's working on the project, couldn't convince her to sell the house, right? So that's the kind of world that we live in. And I don't say that as though it's a negative one. It's that level of complexity, right? And you have to respect that level of complexity if you intend to make change, because that's what it takes.
It's interesting. There's another question I think that touches on. So I think we've talked about, how do you build trust with residents? But on the other side, there's another question that asks, what have been some of the challenges you've encountered in getting buy-in from elected officials, and how have you gone about building support for big audacious goals?
So I'm going to say something because we are among friends here, pun intended, right? If you asked most Black mayors in America, hey, can I build Section 8 housing in your city? What they would tell you is, nah, we don't need any more poor people here. All right. Now that sounds really anti-progressive, doesn't it? That doesn't sound very woke at all. And if you ask that same person a whole litany of other questions that you would use as a barometer of kind of how progressive they are, they check off and say all the right things. But when you get to that question, it's a different issue altogether. We have made poverty like some sort of an illness or sickness. We've also almost made it like it's criminal, right? And in actuality, we need people of every economic environment to be together in order to actually create the kind of diversity in the ecosystem that attracts companies. Diversity in nature is what fuels us and keeps us alive. It's the same with people, and it's not because we feel good and it's the right thing to do. It actually is how we survive as a species, period, right? But it's true economically as well. Most major cities desperately need to find a way to house people that would be defined by whatever the appropriate standard is working class or poor. And most of those cities have only one tool, and that's low-income housing tax credits. And most communities, regardless of what their demographic background is or how rich or poor they are, would do everything in their power to make sure that people that need housing tax credits don't move to their neighborhood. And so the education process for municipal executives about what does it take as a developer to actually finance building housing, whether it be affordable or market rate in their own communities, is a very big challenge, because they think in their minds, well, this is a great neighborhood. Why can't you just build market rate housing? Many communities, the money that you could generate charging market rents for someone to rent an apartment is actually less than what you would get for a low income tax housing voucher. And so when you, as a developer who's going to build 100 unit building, is trying to figure out the capital stack of how do I finance this, I actually need people at all different levels. And most communities, and more than the communities, the municipal executives, they don't want to hear that. They have no interest in that at all. And so we spend a lot of time educating and bringing together the folks that actually spend the money to make this happen with the folks that have to actually legislate and theoretically are the ones that connect to the people. Now, I say theoretically, and I'm not here bad-mouthing politicians. Politician is a skill. It's not a popularity contest. And we make a mistake, I think, as a society, thinking that just any old body can do this work. It actually takes tooling, like being a carpenter or being an electrician. But not all politicians are committed to actually being connected to the people that they represent. And we need that civic infrastructure in order to be able to communicate both things that may be difficult realities for the community to accept, but need to in order to grow, as well as force developers who are happy to do everything that's in the guise of profit to ignore the community. But you need both things to happen. And a lot of our effort is really on educating municipal executives about what's required to pull this off.
And with that, Bo, I think you've given us a lot to think about. We're near the top of the hour. So I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. I think there's many nuggets of wisdom in what you've shared today. But for me, I take at heart, and I think about what can I do to create that civic infrastructure? What can I do to invest in my community and create those spaces? So that's one takeaway for me, certainly. Neville, I don't know if you want to say a few words.
Well, I did want to say I very much appreciate having spent a good deal of my career in government as well as the private sector. Your perspective on that. The fact of the matter is that measuring government performance versus a private sector performance is a fallacy, and to hear you articulate that was very, very impressive to me. I had not met you previously, but clearly your Sidwell DNA has laid a wonderful foundation. I think we could have probably talked for another hour.
Definitely.
I see Anna nodding her head. Do we have any other questions or any other time before we bid a final adieu?
We have a couple more questions, but I think you spoke to a lot of it. And I think we could spend another hour here. So I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. So I think we're gonna move to the end here, but we really appreciate all of the questions that people asked when they were registering, that they asked in the chat tonight. We got a lot of questions, and I wish we could get to all of them, but you did hit a lot of the points or the topics that some of the other questions addressed. So, Bo, thank you so much for spending your time with us tonight.
Well, let me just thank you guys for having me. Sidwell High School was tough because high school is just tough, right? I was nerdy and corny, and Catherine remembers me, I'm sure, as does Tip. But I really ultimately enjoyed my time there, thanks to phenomenal teachers like Juan Jewel that I had, gave me the opportunity to have the breadth of experience, and I'm just honored that you would find my experience worthy enough to come and ask me the questions, and hopefully I shed some light. Obviously, my own one-sided opinion on these issues, but just thank you all for having me. It was a blessing to be here, and I'm just grateful.
We are so grateful that you were willing to come and do this. These events, as you all know, are really driven by you, by the alumni community, what you all have to share, and then what you want to hear with each other. So from each other, excuse me. So I genuinely appreciate your willingness. Kiki and Neville, also, thank you so much for helping to lead this conversation and for all that you do for the Black Alumni Alliance. We're at the tail end here of Black History Month, and so this was a great opportunity to work with two different groups and programs and bring them together in a really special way. We appreciate all of you who are here tonight to participate in this conversation with friends, for you taking time out of your day and being in community with us. Like I said, this series is about you all. It is about the Sidwell Friends community and what you want to hear, have to share. So if you have ideas for events going forward, please let us know. You can email me. You can send it to alumni@sidwell.edu. We want to hear from you on what you want to see next. And speaking of further events, we have two more this school year, one next month in March, with Tony Szilard, who's class of 1985, and then one the first week of April with Margaret Batten, who's class of 1958. So much more to come, but just our thanks for being here, and we can't wait to see you at the next.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Everybody.
Thanks, everybody.